Hello, everyone. Welcome back. I'm so happy that you came back. I have abandonment issues. I'm just kidding. But welcome back to episode 2 of R.O.S.E. I'm your host, Chantel.
And I'm Esther.
And Esther, what are we talking about today?
Today we are going over the mind-body connection, what it is, how it relates to your life on a day-to-day basis, and the tips that you need in order to really understand both sides of that connection.
That resonates, and I've heard feedback from people who I can't stop talking to this about that this is a much-needed episode, so let's get into it.
Absolutely. Okay, well, the main gist of it is that there are certain situations where we get into where we've done it hundreds of times before, and yet we show up to the stage or we show up to like that environment, and for some reason we just can't get it out of our mouth, right? Like I've made hundreds, maybe even thousands of intros at this point to people that I don't know, either in conferences, events, or panels. And every now and again, one of those intros will be so flat. And I'm like, I don't understand. Why is this so flat?
Yeah.
But this connection is one of the main reasons why it happens.
Yeah, and stakes are high in that situation too. So you're like, I usually bring it. What happened?
Yeah.
Makes sense. First thing that comes to mind when I think mind body, I think about 6th grade. I'm auditioning for a musical. It's Cinderella. I know this song like the back of my hand. I know every Cinderella song like the back of my hand in my own little corner. 10 minutes ago I met you, all that good jazz, right? And so I'm going into this thinking like, I got this audition, and I think I did a solid job for the dancing. I did a solid job for the singing. This is in North Carolina, so this is like before I decided to go to a performing arts high school too. I go in there, I'm thinking I'm doing good. We get to the script reading, and when I was in my own element, in my own mind, and own little world, in my own little corner, if you will, if we're going to use the Cinderella analogies.
Perfect.
I was in it. I was in my element, and they saw something in me, the panel of teachers at the time, but they were also, trying to figure out who they were going to cast for the school play. And once I noticed that they saw something in me, I immediately got scared. And then second run around, when they wanted to do like a callback, if you will, to run through the script again, I froze. I didn't not say anything, but my performance, like you were saying, flat. And it wasn't what it was that first time when they saw something in me. So when I could have been Cinderella, I ended up getting casted as the queen.
Which I have to point out, a queen is bigger than a princess, so she won anyway. But in this particular area, that's super cool.
Yeah. So that's the first thing that comes to mind. And for the purpose of this episode, we're going to explore this idea when we're defining the mind and body as a relationship with one another. And we're primarily focusing on that relationship and when stress is present.
Spam. Sorry.
No, you're good. So for the purposes of this episode, we're actually going to define the mind and body as a relationship between the two, what happens cognitive, but what also happens in your body physically, and that relationship that coincides with one another, particularly in times of stress. So think about it as when you are in a stressful situation, your body releases cortisol, right? That's the chemical that your brain sends to your body, and then you start to have all these feelings of, I'm going to die. Just kidding. You're in threat mode, so that's kind of that perceived idea, and it's something that's predisposed in us since
animals.
Primate times.
Yeah.
I don't know. And so when it comes to that mind-body relationship and that default, we have the opposite effect, right? When we're happy, we have all this oxytocin or dopamine that comes out of our system. And it's our body's function and reaction to those chemicals that I think we should pay more attention to in our day-to-day, especially when we're stressed, because that'll allow us to connect our mind and what we know we're capable of to actually follow through in action with our body.
Yes, absolutely.
So when it comes to this idea, I just want to keep in mind with everyone, think about the idea of fight, flight, or freeze. When you are in that panic mode, that natural predisposed stress mode, what do?
And which one are you in? Because that's another really good point, is in each of those scenarios, you're going to respond in different ways to the same exact stressor. So different scenarios, same stressor, different reactions in the body that you'll have to actually keep in mind.
Right. So I'm going to throw some definitions out for you all for the purpose of this exploration of ideas. I'm actually really excited for this episode. So some key terms that I thought was really interesting regarding fight, flight, or freeze.
Yes.
Let's use a similar analogy. Let's say that our fight could be avoidance. And so if we are experiencing some level of fight, even, I guess, if you're being reactive, you're kind of fighting something and avoiding maybe something more internally if you're being angry, right? And so if we're thinking about avoidance, avoidance can be defined as behaviors to prevent or minimize contact with fear, anxiety, including objects or situations, and it could lead to very restrictive lives when we're in that avoidance mode, when our nervous system like sets into that default mode.
Right.
So fight, avoidance. When we're thinking about flight, I mean, that can kind of go either way, flight and fear and freeze. So you can kind of think of like flight, fear, and freeze with the same veins of anxiety and fear. And the two differences with those definitions, anxiety is the anticipation of a future threat, vigilance and using caution. So that's why when people have maybe some level of stagnant anxiety or an anxiety disorder, you're thinking of anticipation of perceived threats, things that have not yet happened. And that's what makes fear different in terms of a definition, because fear is an imminent threat. Something is happening to you. Someone is at my door, right? And that's fear. Or someone is currently breaking up with me. That is fear, you know? So those definitions stick with me, how fear is imminent threat, whereas anxiety is anticipation, and then avoidance is just behaviors that try to minimize those threats if possible, but then that just leads to a restricted life.
Makes total sense.
Yeah.
So one of the first discussion questions that we have for today is, what messages are your body sending you? And those are some of those messages of are you anxious? Are you anticipating a future threat? Is it fear? Is it the current threat that it's the imminent, you have to deal with this now kind of thing? And then what is your body doing in order to actually avoid the threat or that kind of the threat that's coming at you, essentially?
Yeah. When I think back to the story that I mentioned earlier with Cinderella and me auditioning, the messages that my body were sending me back then were, we are in danger. They see something in you and you have a lot to prove. And so if you mess this up, we're done, right? And I'm 11, 12 years old, so that's high stakes. And that is what, by definition, for the purpose of this episode, I would quantify as anxiety, like the perceived fear that I might mess up a line in a callback or something. So the messages that my body was sending me is that we have a problem here. You're under pressure. You can't mess up. You can't fail. And so what did I do instead? As a response to that message, I shrunk myself and then I delivered a flat performance. So that way, if my delivery was less than, then there's no room for failure because I've already delivered something flat. And what a disservice to me as someone who knew that I could do this, you know?
Yes. And I think that's a really important kind of thing to focus on, is that your mind is going to say, we need to do this in order to complete a specific purpose or a goal in life or whatever, and it's the body unintentionally fights back.
Yes, the body fights back, which leads us to our second question, which is, how much do you pay attention to your body at that moment, and why is it important to notice? And we wrote this question down because your body sends messages in the fight or flight or freeze mode. Those same definitions that I mentioned earlier, that anxiety, that fear, and that avoidance, they are communicating messages to you. And for the story that I referenced, it was fear. You can't do this. You're going to mess up. So maybe if you deliver a less, than adequate performance, then there's nowhere to go from there if you fail, right? That was the message that I received, and how unfair was that to me? So you're going to react to your body's hormones. That's what I did back in the 6th grade, and I think that fight, flight, or freeze is important to kind of recognize, pay attention in the body, and if those things are blocking you from success, it's important for you to achieve what you desire and your goals if you want to advance yourself. So slowing the body down and being like, what is going on right now? I know I'm stressed out, and what am I feeling, and what is that saying to me?
And for the purposes of this conversation, we're going to call the flight, fright, and freeze the triple F. So we don't want that to mess with our goals and life aspirations. And sometimes it's important to give the mind a little bit more oomph so that the body does not take over.
Right, yeah, and when you have a triple F moment, obviously in the moment you are reacting, so there's not that much of a time for you to be like, oh, well, let me slow down and go to the steps that Esther and Chantel
No, definitely not.
taught me. But I think it's a practice that's gradual, and the more that you could even have the awareness that your body is going to communicate things to you that will manifest in actions that actually might not be helpful to you if you slow down and reflect on what's going on, I think that's important to notice.
And that brings up to the next question, which is how do you even notice it in the body? Like, what are the physiological responses? I know my hands start getting sweaty, the heart rate will start increasing, your immune system and your digestion at the same time will shut down, because when we're running away from tigers in the savannah back then, that was important. All the energy needed to go to our muscles, right, to like run. But unfortunately, we're not running from anything, but we'll still get, you know, the sweaty palms and the everything that we, as humans, running away from things need in order to run faster.
Yeah, that resonates. That makes sense. For me, I start to feel tension in my shoulders. I start to physically shrink myself.
Yes.
I mentioned that in the story, but that's still something we're working on. And so I'll start to do a lot of self-touch, or you'll see me kind of like shrink inward to myself, so you might see that often in the body. And then what do you feel? I know that's a cliche thing that people think that therapists should ask. By the way, if your therapist asks that, they should go deeper. They could just ask literally anything else, but I digress. What do you feel?
Right.
And are you feeling tension in the chest? Are you feeling it in the shoulders? I don't breathe when I'm nervous and anxious. So a good question to ask is, holy crap, am I quite literally breathing through my nose? Because you don't really recognize, holy crap, I'm not breathing. I'm trying not to curse so we don't get demonetized.
Understandably.
Yeah. So yeah, that's one thing that I notice in my body.
And honestly, even if you don't notice it, immediately counteract it, because if you don't have it now, you might in 10 seconds. So breathing in when you're at that moment of you feel that fear spike you, like, okay, now we're going to take a deep, long breath.
And while Esther is on that note, how about we all just take a second and just deep breath, right? I feel like I needed that in this moment.
That's wonderful. That is what we needed. Yeah. So one of the biggest things that I would like everyone to know as well is extended fight or flight response when you're anxious every day. If your immune system shuts down and your digestion system shuts down every time you're in that state of fight or flight, that will probably lead to digestion issues and autoimmune diseases and heart attacks, which is one of the biggest things that we have due to consistent fight or flight activation. So our goal is to notice when you're having it and counteract it constructively instead of destructively, which destructive is pretty much just letting it run without actually putting it towards something, because it's energy in the body.
I like that you mentioned that idea. And something that's important to note too is that slowing down in the body, I feel like we're communicating this as an opportunity for people to improve themselves. I have an unpopular position, perhaps, that this is actually in response to the environment that our society creates for us. And I just thought, before we continue on to the next question about whether we cognitively agree with these messages, I want to first acknowledge that our society being this just incubator for instant gratification, instant results. We are in a time of this world where we are constantly measuring ourselves and almost turning ourselves into machines. So it is important to recognize your humanity, and something as simple as breathing is a reminder that you are human, you are not perfect, you make mistakes, and our body by default goes into this fight or flight system. So this is also an opportunity for you as a human to have more patience and grace with yourself and recognize, oh, don't worry, body, I don't need to go into that right now. I actually want to do this. And imagine the possibilities that can come from you being able to slow down and do that just through breathing.
Which brings us to the next question, which is, do you cognitively agree with the messages your body is telling you? So in the case of your Cinderella performance, right, is your body was telling you freeze because it's safer if you shrink yourself, right, then doing whatever it is you're doing is scary. And so the consequence is, and this is the funny thing about fight, flight, and freeze, right? Flight is usually fear. The reaction is a stronger fear. Fight is the reaction is actually anger, which is a larger feeling. It's more of a powerful feeling. Freeze is you disattach from yourself. So procrastination is due to a freeze response in your body. So you disattached from your body in that moment in Cinderella. And when you lift yourself out of a moment, we get this mind blank, nothing comes out of my mouth, which is only with freeze, not in flight or fight.
Yeah.
Really.
Then I reversed the definitions because I put avoidance along with anger, but you're saying that freeze might be more in correlation with
avoidance?
Avoidance because I'm minimizing that contact with that fear
In
by
a way.
shrinking myself.
I mean, I think that fight and all of them are in a way avoidance, right? It's just that like freeze is very directly I'm distancing versus fight is I'm avoiding this by like making
Going
myself
directly at
bigger,
it, yeah.
right? Like bigger. I want all of it. And then flight, I would say, is the fear that you mentioned, and is like I'm just going to let it take me where it needs to take me, which is just let the fear sit in you in a way.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, it's really interesting. And the messages that they say is like with fight, right? You're saying I'm bigger than whatever this thing is, and I'm going to kill it. I'm going to destroy it. Which, if it's a car in front of you, you're probably not going to kill the car. You know, the road rage is you're not going to actually murder the car in front of you. And then the easiest way to like constructively direct it is, okay, if I'm feeling angry at the car in front of me and I want to kill it, isn't that hilarious? So the easiest emotion to like transmute that into is amusement, in my perspective, specifically using flight as an example. And then with anxiety, it's, let's see, if you're scared, I think it's just body physiologically being like, okay, we're okay. And the breathing will help kind of recenter yourself.
Yeah, I think the way that this question, do you like cognitively agree with the messages, all the points that you're saying, and then I think that your actions are also responses to these secret messages that your body is telling you. So I get, for lack of a better word, your inner critic.
Yeah.
Some people might personify this as. So if we're compartmentalizing each stage of this whole mind-body relationship, you're in an experience that triggers that fight or flight as your default.
Yes.
And then you're saying that fight, flight, or freeze, your actions are kind of manifesting your anger, your fear, freezing. Those are reactions to that default, right? Those reactions to that default communicate underlying messages as well. And those underlying messages can really say some nasty things to you.
Yeah.
If you really take a second and think about it.
What it means.
Right. And if I'm using that example from like 6th grade, my body in that fight or flight mode said it's better for you to be nobody than for you to stand out and be somebody. Right now, that's what that message told me and the body. So, all of the questions that we're asking, like how much do you pay attention? Why is it important? And the biggest question, do you cognitively agree? Because do I really agree with it's better for you when you love this play right now to shrink yourself and be nobody than be somebody? No, I don't agree with that. But my body told me that and I listened. So I think it's important in those moments to ask yourself whether you agree or disagree with like these fear responses and reactions that your body's telling you. Do you want to fight that car or that person? And in that moment, do you agree with that action? And that's why you always get people after they've done something like anxiously or out of anger. They're like, I'm sorry, I didn't mean it.
Yes.
Because they reacted. And this is also in an effort to get people to responsibly respond to one another in these moments, because our body by default is going to do this. It's going to pounce. And it's up to us to kind of recognize that from a more mature perspective and respond accordingly.
Yeah, and that's why, like, with the fight, right, you tend to shrink yourself because you're like, this thing is larger than me.
Right.
And it's like, the reality is, no, we're probably humans and the thing is a piece of paper. Like, we are literally larger than it. Like, we can take it. And with the freeze, what I found is the best way is to, like, hone in on your vision or your purpose, right? Because you wanted Cinderella. Like, if we take that energy of disattachment and be like, okay, well, if you're disattached, if I'm already kind of I might as well give it my all because I don't care about the thing, right? Is like, and we're going to funnel the purpose of I'm going to get the number one and use that energy of disattachment to be like, yeah, I will, and I don't care. It's hard, but it's possible.
You mentioned this just a moment ago about
Yeah.
this idea of like using your energy constructively or destructively. I think this whole idea of slowing the body down, paying attention to your mind versus body, and developing a better relationship is that when these default moments occur, how can you refocus that energy? And then in many respects, it will likely manifest into a destructive pattern of behavior, not necessarily by way of anger. It could be fear or anxiety as well. How can you take that same energy and then utilize it constructively?
Yes, make it simple, which is our next discussion question, by the way. Refocus your energy to constructive thought or movement too, because the triple F is it really constructive if it's getting in the way of your goals and your dreams and what you want for your life.
Right, and at least for me, and honestly, I mean, you don't have to do anything in this world. I feel like a lot of podcasts will be like, you got to go for gold, and you have to get anything, and I think that's what makes our podcast differently. We're just exploring ideas, and hopefully these ideas give you little seeds of wisdom that help you figure out what's best for you, but you could also listen to this and be like, these girls are crazy. I don't care.
Because we're not here to tell you what to do. We are trying to show you how you are, like your being. How are you being? How is your being, right?
Right.
And then go from there.
Right. And so an example, and I think that this is why Esther and I get along so well, is in the face of when our default flight or flight responses kick in, we make a decision to refocus our energy towards something more constructive. Obviously, this is a practice.
Yeah.
Practice does not make perfect. It makes progress. And we are visionaries when it comes to this idea. I think we thrive off of epiphany and progress. I think that's what makes the human experience so beautiful, is that you get to mess up and make mistakes, but you also get to make right on those actions and grow and evolve, because that's really what we are meant to do on this earth.
Absolutely, yeah. So, as a little summary from this adventure that we took you on and we ourselves went on, if you're feeling fight, do you agree with fighting whatever it is that you're dealing with? And if not, can you make it into amusement? Can you laugh at yourself in that moment? Because laughter and fight, they both have this powerful vibe so that really does help. So bigness, right? If you're in fear, if so you're like, I feel smaller than this thing, is this thing a phone call? Can you pace? Can you move your body to like get your body that flight?
Yeah,
without
through it.
Actually like saying that this thing is bigger than me, because phone calls are not larger than us, they're tiny. And with the freeze, right? So if you have the freeze response, link back into why you're doing this. What is your purpose? Use the disattachment of that moment to be like, to check back in with, I'm doing this because I want to introduce myself to the people in this room. I want to get this number one slot. And come back to your body with more focus. That'll help a lot.
I love that. Yeah, some tactical things to add on to these ideas is, how can you even calm your physiology down enough to even make these switches in those moments? Once your body hits that default response, is to breathe like we did earlier in the episode. Try that again. Exhale longer than your inhale. You can do some tapping with the body, and that kind of tactical motion with the body kind of brings you out of your mind back into the present experience of life, and that tapping can give you into some grounding place. You could also think of some happy place or some public setting, and that regulates the body to kind of get into realignment with your mind. And then continuing on that idea, thinking of a peaceful space. For me, it's my house, because I love the exposed brick. But yeah, I think that those physiological little tips help you kind of think to yourself, all right, like, I'm scared. Esther and Chantel said that maybe I I might need to double check this before I react, right?
Yeah.
And so, okay, slow down. Pay attention to my body in the moment. Am I freezing up? Okay, yeah, I am. Let me move around a little bit because I can tell that I'm anxious. Let me breathe and then make that switch. Like, be like, okay, I'm going to move around and then I'm going to constructively go for it, because that's the worst that's going to happen is that you're going to fail, and then it's going to give you an opportunity to make a switch and be better the next time around.
And the important thing to note too is that next time will be faster. It's going to be tough the first 100 times you do it, but if you do that, which I mean, I get that response at least twice a day, so within 2 months you'll be a pro at it. You're going to notice that it comes faster, more easily, and you'll be less stressed out as a whole, which is what we want overall.
Right. Someone wise once told me that winners were quitters that didn't stop, and obviously losers are quitters.
Yeah.
And so when you think about that, you think about, I feel like a lot of people go into this fight or flight mode and they automatically are in that position because they're afraid to fail at something, at a relationship or work. But it's important to recognize that that's part of the lived experience, is going through these things and maybe not fulfilling it the way that you thought you would, but not letting that be the end, not letting your failure be final, and making a decision to keep going and to see what could come from life after learning what not to do.
Absolutely. So from two best friends having tea time, I hope you enjoyed.
We'll see you next time.